The lawyer slid the keys across his desk and said there were 14 of them on the ring, and that 13 would open every door in my aunt's house. The 14th, he told me, opened nothing I needed to worry about. He was wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why an entire family will beg a woman not to walk into her own inherited home. And you'll understand why she walked in anyway, and what it cost her to finally do it. My name is Louise. I was 49 years old the week my Aunt Vivian died, and I inherited a house nobody in my family expected me to get. I need to explain something about my family before I explain the house, because the two things are impossible to separate. I was the practical one. Every family has one. The person who gets called when someone needs a ride to the airport, or help filling out insurance forms, but never the person anyone thinks to sit down and really talk to. My brother Peter got the warmth. My cousin Ted got the charm. My mother, if I'm honest, got the final say on almost everything. In the quiet way certain mothers manage to hold on to authority long after their children have grown up and moved away. I got competence, which is a lovely word for being useful and forgettable. At the same time, I remember the exact moment I understood my role in the family, though I couldn't have named it that way at the time. I was 11 years old at my grandmother's 80th birthday party, and I'd spent the whole afternoon quietly refilling drinks and helping the caterers, while Peter told stories that made the whole table laugh, and Ted charmed every aunt within earshot. My mother pulled me aside near the end of the night, not to thank me, but to ask if I'd remembered to bring extra napkins for the car ride home. That was the whole conversation. I remember standing there thinking, even at 11, that I had apparently already been assigned my permanent role in this family, and nobody had bothered to ask if I wanted it. Aunt Vivian was different from the rest of them, though it took me decades to understand exactly how. She never married, never had children of her own, and spent most of her adult life in a tall, narrow Victorian house on the edge of town that the rest of the family treated like a slightly embarrassing relative in his own right. Too old, too strange, too much upkeep. Vivian herself they treated the same way, kind in a distant sort of way, included but never truly consulted. I understood her better than I let on because I recognized the treatment. It was the treatment I got too, just with better real estate attached to it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being tolerated rather than seen, and I think Vivian and I recognized it in each other long before either of us ever said so out loud. She used to send me birthday cards with handwritten notes longer than anyone else bothered to write. Small observations about books she thought I'd like, or questions about my life that suggested she'd actually been paying attention. I didn't appreciate how rare that was until much later. She died in October quietly, the way people who've spent decades being quiet tend to. I found out from Peter, who called to say the funeral would be small, family only, and that the reading of the will would happen the following week at Vivian's attorney's office downtown. The funeral itself was smaller than I expected, even for a woman who lived so much of her life at the edges of things. A handful of neighbors, a woman from her book club who cried harder than anyone else in the room and later told me in the receiving line that Vivian had been the kindest person she'd ever known, which struck me as a strange thing to hear about a woman my own family always described using words like private and reserved, as though kindness and privacy were somehow opposites. I almost didn't go to the will reading. I assumed reasonably that I'd get a set of her old teacups or a modest check and that would be that. My mother, my brother, my cousin Ted and his wife Rachel all sat in that office with expressions of polite, restrained anticipation, the kind people wear when they've quietly done math about an inheritance without ever saying the math out loud. The attorney, a soft-spoken man named Harold Pierce, who'd apparently handled Vivian's affairs for almost 30 years, read through the will efficiently. Small bequests to a handful of old friends. A generous donation to the local historical society, which struck me as oddly specific at the time, though I didn't think much of it. And then, without much ceremony at all, the house, the entire house, the land it sat on, and everything inside it to me. The room went very quiet. Then it went less quiet, in the particular way a room gets when people are trying very hard to seem unbothered by something that has clearly bothered them enormously. "That's generous," my mother finally said, in a tone that suggested the opposite of generous. Rachel recovered fastest. "Well, Louise is so good at that sort of thing. Practical things. Old houses." She said it kindly enough that I couldn't quite call it an insult, though it certainly wasn't a compliment either. Peter didn't say much of anything, which from Peter was its own kind of statement. Ted leaned over to whisper something to Rachel that I didn't catch, and the two of them exchanged a look I recognized instantly, the look of people quietly recalculating what they'd assumed about somebody. Harold Pierce cleared his throat and continued with the reading, and it was only afterward in the parking lot that Peter pulled me aside. "You know there's a room in that house nobody goes into," he said. Not a question. "The one at the end of the upstairs hall," I said. "I remember it being locked when we were kids." "It's still locked," Peter said. "Vivian never let anyone in there. Not once. Not in 40 years. Mom thinks it's where she kept, I don't know, whatever happened to her, whatever made her the way she was. We all just left it alone. You should leave it alone too." I want to be honest about how that sentence landed. It didn't land like concern. It landed like an instruction, delivered by someone who had never once, in my entire life, given me an instruction about anything that mattered to him personally. That's what made me start paying attention. My mother caught up with us before I got to my car, and repeated almost the identical sentiment, though with more urgency behind it. "Vivian had her struggles, Louise. Things from a long time ago. Whatever's in there is not going to bring you anything but heartache. Just sell the house. Take the money. Let sleeping things stay asleep." "That's oddly specific for something you claim you don't know anything about," I said. My mother's expression flickered just briefly before she recovered it into something smoother. "I know enough," she said, and got into her car without elaborating further. The following weekend, I drove out to the house alone. Vivian's house sat on a quiet street with old oak trees leaning protectively over the sidewalk, the kind of neighborhood where every porch light still worked and every lawn was mowed out of habit rather than pride. The house itself was narrow and tall, white paint, gone slightly gray with age, a wraparound porch that creaked in a way that felt more like conversation than complaint. I let myself in with the ring of 13 working keys, and Harold Pierce's voice in my head telling me the 14th opened nothing I needed to worry about. The inside of the house smelled like lavender and old paper, a smell I would come to associate over the following weeks with everything that turned out to matter. Vivian's furniture was modest but well cared for. Photographs lined the staircase wall. Decades of family gatherings where Vivian stood at the edges of every frame, present but somehow peripheral, exactly the way I remembered her at every holiday of my own childhood. I stopped halfway up the stairs and studied one photograph for a long time. A Christmas gathering from sometime in the early 90s. My grandfather seated proudly at the head of the table. Vivian standing near the kitchen doorway, half turned away from the camera, as though she'd been caught in the act of leaving the room rather than joining it. I walked the length of the upstairs hallway until I reached the door at the end. Dark wood, an old brass lock, nothing dramatic about it except the fact that 4 different family members had, at various points over the years, mentioned it to me unprompted, always with the same careful, deliberate casualness people use when they want you to think something isn't important. I tried the 13 keys, one after another in the lock. None of them fit. That's when I remembered the 14th key sitting in my coat pocket. The one Harold Pierce told me opened nothing I needed to worry about. It fit the lock perfectly. I stood there for a long moment before I turned it. The way you stand at the edge of cold water before deciding whether you're actually going to get in. Then I turned the key, and the door opened onto a room that had clearly not been touched in years, except that someone at some point had been keeping it very carefully maintained despite that. It wasn't a shrine to grief the way my mother had implied. It was an office, a working office, meticulously organized, lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves, and a large oak desk positioned beneath the room's single window. Dust covered the surfaces in a thin, undisturbed layer, but underneath the dust, everything sat in the kind of order that only comes from someone who cared enormously about keeping track of something. On the desk sat a single leather folder, and on top of that folder, a note in Vivian's handwriting. To whichever one of you finally has the nerve to open this door. It should be Louise. It usually is. I sat down in my aunt's desk chair and opened the folder, and I didn't leave that room again for almost 3 hours. Inside were documents going back nearly 60 years, property deeds, business ledgers, correspondence, some of it typed, some of it handwritten, between my grandfather and a man named Elijah Marsh. As I read further, a story assembled itself that none of my family had ever told me. Possibly because none of my family had ever wanted to know it themselves. My grandfather, in the years just after the war, had gone into business with Elijah Marsh, a black machinist and inventor who held the actual patent on a piece of manufacturing equipment that eventually became the foundation of our family's modest fortune. The correspondence made it painfully clear what had happened next. My grandfather had used legal maneuvering, a compliant local judge, and a series of contracts written in language Marsh likely never fully understood to force him out of the partnership entirely, keeping the patent and the growing business for himself while Marsh received almost nothing. I found a photograph clipped to one of the earliest documents, 2 men standing in front of a modest workshop. My grandfather on the left, younger than I'd ever seen him in any family photo, and beside him a taller man with careful eyes and a guarded half-smile, who I understood before I even read the caption had to be Elijah Marsh. Someone at some point had written a single word beneath the photograph in pencil, so faint I had to tilt it toward the window light to read it clearly. Partners, it said. Just that. Vivian, it turned out, had discovered this history decades ago, going through our grandfather's papers after his death, and rather than confront the family publicly, she had spent the rest of her adult life quietly trying to make it right. Locating Marsh's descendants, setting aside money, documenting everything with the precision of someone building a case she intended eventually for someone else to finish. There was a second folder beneath the first containing recent correspondence, only a few years old, between Vivian and a woman named Dorothy Marsh Whitfield, Elijah Marsh's granddaughter, a retired professor living 2 states away. I read through nearly a dozen letters, watching a friendship take shape across the pages, cautious at first on Dorothy's side, understandably so, then gradually warmer, Two women in their 70s writing to each other about gardens and grandchildren and running underneath everything. The slow, patient work of documenting an old injustice neither of them had caused and both of them had somehow inherited. The most recent letter, dated less than a year before Vivian's death, was unfinished. Dorothy, I think it's finally time I told the rest of the family what I found. I'm sorry it's taken me this long to find the courage. I keep telling myself I'm protecting them from an unpleasant truth. But the truth was never really mine to protect them from. It belonged to your family first. The letter stopped there, mid-sentence, the way unfinished things often do when someone runs out of time rather than words. I sat in that room until the light outside the window went orange, then gray, and I understood, with a clarity that settled into my chest like something physical, exactly why my entire family had spent years quietly agreeing that this particular door should stay shut. I didn't tell any of them what I found. Not yet. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't only strategy, though strategy was certainly part of it. For the first time in my life, I was holding something that mattered enormously, something my family couldn't reduce to the word practical and set gently aside. I wasn't ready to hand it to them until I understood exactly what I was holding. Over the following 3 weeks, I did what Vivian herself had apparently done for decades. I researched carefully, quietly, methodically, going to the house most evenings after work and losing entire hours in that upstairs room. The lavender and old paper smell becoming as familiar to me as my own home. I drove to the county records office and confirmed the original patent filing under Elijah Marsh's name, dated 1951, still on record, still technically valid in ways that made a title researcher I hired, a careful, unhurried woman named Sandra Kwan, raise both eyebrows when she called to explain the implications. In 60 years of doing this work, Sandra told me over the phone, I've seen maybe 3 cases this clean. Whoever assembled this file for you knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't assembling it for me, I said. Not originally. Well, Sandra said, she certainly left it in the right hands eventually. I found Dorothy Marsh Whitfield's phone number through the State University's retired faculty directory and sat with it for 3 days before I finally called. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice careful in the particular way people sound when they've spent a lifetime being cautious about unfamiliar phone calls. My name is Louise, I said. I believe you knew my Aunt Vivian. There was a long pause. Vivian passed, Dorothy said. It wasn't a question. In October, I said. I found your correspondence, and I found the folders she kept about your grandfather and mine. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed entirely. I've been waiting most of my adult life for somebody in your family to say that sentence to me, she said. We talked for almost 2 hours that first call. Dorothy's grandfather had died believing the patent and the business he'd built were simply permanently lost to him. A story of quiet theft that had been absorbed into family history, the way painful things often are, discussed rarely, resented constantly, never resolved. Dorothy herself had grown up hearing fragments of it, enough to understand her family had been wronged, never enough to prove exactly how. She told me about her grandfather's later years, running a small repair shop 2 towns over, a shadow of what he'd built and lost, and how he'd never once, as far as she knew, spoken his old partner's name again after the business folded out from under him. He kept a photograph, though, Dorothy said, of the 2 of them outside the old workshop. I have it still. I always wondered why he kept a picture of the man who ruined him. I think I might have the other copy of that same photograph, I said quietly, and told her about the pencil word written beneath it. Partners. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment after that. He never stopped believing that word, even after everything, she finally said. I think that's the saddest part of this whole story. I hired an attorney the following week, not Harold Pierce, who I suspected had known more about that locked room than he'd let on, but an independent attorney named Priya Anand, who specialized in historical property claims. She reviewed every document in Vivian's folder over the course of 2 long meetings, laying pages out across her conference table like a woman assembling a puzzle she already suspected the shape of. This isn't just a moral case, Priya told me, sliding a folder of her own across her desk during our second meeting. This is a legally viable claim. Vivian built almost the entire thing for you already. She just never filed it. I asked her why Vivian would spend decades assembling an airtight case and never actually use it. Priya considered the question carefully. Some people build the whole bridge and then can't make themselves take the final step to actually walk across it, she said. Sometimes it takes someone else to do that last part for them. Priya also explained something that changed the shape of everything for me. The judge who'd approved the original contract transfer, a man named Wexler, who'd sat on the county bench for over 20 years, had been quietly investigated and disbarred decades later in an entirely unrelated matter involving bribery, in a series of property disputes throughout that same period. It wasn't proof specific to my grandfather's case, Priya cautioned, but it was exactly the kind of corroborating context that made the entire pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Your aunt found that detail too, Priya said, tapping a newspaper clipping tucked near the back of Vivian's folder, brittle and yellowed. A small local article about Wexler's disbarment that Vivian had apparently saved decades earlier, long before she connected it to anything involving her own family. I decided the confrontation would happen at Thanksgiving. I want to be clear that this wasn't cruelty on my part, though I understand how it might look that way. Thanksgiving was simply the next moment the entire family would be assembled in one room, at my mother's house, the way we were every year, performing the particular choreography of politeness that had defined every family gathering I could remember. In the days leading up to it, my mother called twice, each time steering the conversation carefully toward the house, asking whether I thought any more about selling it, whether I'd been inside that room. Her voice tightening slightly around the word room in a way that told me, more clearly than any document in Vivian's folder, exactly how much she already suspected. I've been inside, I told her the second time she called. We can talk about it Thursday. Louise, she said, and for a moment her voice lost all its careful control. Whatever you think you found in there, please just think very carefully before you do anything with it. I have been thinking carefully, I said, for 3 weeks. I think that's more than anyone else in this family managed to do in 60 years. She didn't have a response to that, and we hung up shortly after in a silence that felt, for the first time in my adult life, like I had actually won something. Thanksgiving arrived cold and overcast. The whole family gathered in my mother's dining room the way we gathered every year for as long as I could remember. Dinner moved through its usual rhythms. My mother's carefully curated conversation topics, Peter's stories about his kids' school activities, Rachel asking me, with the same faint condescension as always, how I was managing the upkeep on that big old house. Actually, I said, I wanted to talk to everyone about the house tonight. The table went quiet in the specific way it had gone quiet in Harold Pierce's office months earlier. I found the room, I said. The locked one. Peter's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother's hand tightened slightly around her wine glass. Ted glanced at Rachel, then back at me, with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Something closer to genuine unease than his usual practiced charm. "Louise," my mother said carefully, "I really don't think this is the time." "I think it's exactly the time," I said, "because I also found out why none of you wanted me to open it." I told them everything. Elijah Marsh, the patent, the forced buyout, the judge later exposed for corruption, Vivian's decades of quiet documentation, the letters to Dorothy, the folder she'd left with my name essentially written across the top of it. I told them about the photograph and the single word written beneath it in pencil, and I watched my mother's face change when I said it out loud. And nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Peter, in a voice that had lost all its earlier certainty, said, "That was 60 years ago. None of us did anything." "No," I said, "but we've been living comfortably off what he did for 60 years. And Vivian spent the second half of her life trying to fix it quietly enough that none of us would ever have to feel uncomfortable about it. I'm done doing that particular family tradition." My mother set down her wine glass with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "What exactly are you planning to do?" "I've already done most of it," I said. "I hired an attorney. Dorothy Marsh Whitfield, Elijah's granddaughter, has agreed to pursue a formal claim. The patent filing is still valid. My attorney believes it's a strong case. Strong enough that we settle rather than went to court. Half the value of the original business, adjusted and calculated by a historical asset specialist, transfers to Dorothy's family this spring. I'm covering my portion of that from the house and its holdings, since that's what Vivian left specifically to me." Rachel actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're giving away half of Vivian's estate to someone we've never even met?" "I'm giving back something that was never ours to keep," I said. Vivian understood that a long time before any of us did. She just ran out of time to finish it herself. "You could have talked to us first," my mother said, her voice tight. "As a family." "I did talk to this family first," I said. "I talked to Peter in a parking lot. I talked to you on the phone twice. Both times, every single one of you told me in almost the same words to leave it alone and sell the house. I don't think as a family has ever meant deciding things together in this house. I think it's meant everyone quietly agreeing to protect the same comfortable silence and calling that agreement." My mother didn't have an answer for that. Ted, of everyone at the table, was the one who finally broke the silence that followed. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think Vivian would be glad it was you who opened it." The restitution agreement was formalized in March in a modest conference room at Priya and Nin's office, with Dorothy Marsh Whitfield sitting across the table from me for the first time in person. She was 71 years old, sharp-eyed, dressed in a simple gray suit that made her look exactly like the retired professor she was, and she brought with her, tucked carefully inside a folder of her own, the twin photograph of the two young men outside the workshop, the word partners written beneath it in a different hand than Vivian's. Older, more careful. We laid both photographs side by side on the table before we signed anything. 2 copies of the same faded moment, kept separately for 60 years by 2 families who'd never once spoken to each other about what had actually happened between them. When the paperwork was finally signed, Dorothy looked at me for a long moment and said, "Your aunt wrote to me for 6 years before she died. I used to wonder if she'd ever actually do anything, or if the letters were just her way of feeling better about doing nothing." "I used to wonder the same thing about my whole family," I said. "About myself, honestly, for a long time." Dorothy studied me carefully. "And now?" "Now I think some people spend their whole lives being the one nobody expects anything important from," I said. "And then one day they get handed exactly the kind of thing that was always meant for them." She smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from her. Vivian would have liked that answer. The historical society my aunt had donated a portion of her estate to ended up documenting the entire case, at Dorothy's request, as part of a regional exhibit on overlooked Black inventors and patent theft in the post-war manufacturing industry. Elijah Marsh's name went up on a placard in a small local museum 18 months later, alongside the original 1951 patent filing, the recovered photograph, and a short account of what had finally been done to correct the record. I stood in that museum on opening night with Dorothy beside me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like the important part of a room instead of the practical part. My family's relationship with me shifted after that, though not instantly, and not entirely in the direction people always assume in stories like this. My mother needed almost a year before she could talk about it without a defensive edge creeping into her voice. Peter, to his credit, eventually admitted he'd known more than he let on that day in the parking lot, that Vivian had once tried, gently, to tell him a version of the story years earlier, and he'd changed the subject because it made him uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he told me the following Thanksgiving, in a kitchen considerably quieter than the one the year before. "I think we all just decided a long time ago that you were the one who'd deal with the hard, unpleasant things so none of the rest of us had to." "You weren't wrong," I said. "I was. I just didn't understand yet that being the one who deals with hard things and being the one who matters least in the room were never actually the same thing." I still live in Vivian's house. I turned the locked room back into an office, her desk still positioned beneath the same window, though I added a second chair for the afternoons Dorothy visits when she's in town, which has become more often than either of us expected. We keep both photographs framed side by side on the wall above the desk now, the two young men and their careful workshop smiles, the pencil word between them finally meaning something closer to the truth. Every so often, someone in my family will bring up the will, half joking, saying I got lucky, that the house turned out to be worth more than anyone imagined. I let them say it now. I don't correct them anymore, because I've stopped needing them to understand what actually happened in that room. I know what it was. It was a woman who spent her whole life on the edges of every family photograph, finally deciding, 60 years too late for some and just barely in time for others, that some doors are locked not to keep the truth out, but to wait patiently for the one person willing enough to finally turn the key.